Welcome again to A Night for Truth. I'm Tom Howard, and I have with me here on the set Dr. Alice von Hildebrand, and we are talking about the life and the work and the legacy of Dr. von Hildebrand's husband, Dietrich von Hildebrand, the great 20th century Catholic thinker and philosopher and theologian. I might say, just by the by, that the knight we have in that title there is the man on a horse in armor with a lance, not the dark part of the day. He was a true knight for the truth. And we have been speaking of Dietrich von Hildebrand's background, his life and biography, his family in Florence, and you will see as we go along that there is an increasingly close connection which really ends up being a virtually seamless fabric between his life and his work. And I think when we reached the end of our last chat, Lily, we had come to the point where at least for my money, two important points had emerged, basically from your speaking about his life, and yet at least two things, if not more, emerged which will loom larger and larger in his work and in the significance of his work, namely his encounter with the absolute, with that which is fixed and unchanging. And that is a major theme in all of his work, which sets him, if you will think briefly, virtually at a polar extreme from our own epoch, in which each individual, school children, etc., are taught the reality is me, and I make my decisions as to whether I resonate to something or whether I turn on to something. The truth or the falsehood of something is nothing more and nothing less than whether I happen to respond to it. Whereas Dietrich von Hildebrand saw and never stopped bearing witness to what we might call real reality, to the stark nature of reality, which is fixed and unchanging, and we are addressed by it. We don't judge it. It looks at us and asks for a response. And secondly, we had just come up to the point where a philosopher, Max Scheler, I believe this is right, had introduced...
Scheler.
Yes, Max Scheler had used the word holiness to the young Dietrich von Hildebrand, and this was a startling new category. Lily, perhaps you could pick up at this point.
You know, it seems to me that it is such a crucial moment in his life that it's going to give you a key to further development. Living in Florence, living in Italy, living in a Catholic culture, he had never encountered living, practicing Catholics. And suddenly to hear that the Catholic Church has a truth because it produces saints. You know, that is a test of the truth of a particular religion. What does it produce at its very best? And Scheler used his genius in sketching the essence of holiness, this total transformation of man's fallen nature to reach a glorious level that, so to speak, copies, imitates Christ. And that was for my husband so overwhelming that from this moment on there was a seed in his soul which is going to blossom. It's going to take another 7 years because he was someone who had passionate interests. It was music, it was concert, it was museum, it was friendship, it was party. You should not name it. He was an extrovert, he was someone who loved life, and he worked very hard. But leaps and bounds when he felt like it. But he was not someone like Edith Stein who could sit in front of her desk and study 18 hours in a row. He never did that, and he would never have done it because he said, I'm going to learn from life and from experiences. I mean, there's no doubt that his aesthetics, for example, is fed on 70 years of profound aesthetic experiences.
And I think this is important, too, because I'm sure that many people, when they hear the word saint or sainthood, they think immediately of a holy card with a pastel picture of one of the saints, possibly surrounded with clouds or floating in the air, certainly with a halo. And I think that picture, partly true as it may be, needs to be clarified and qualified by meeting the kind of saint and saintliness which we see in your husband.
You know, I do believe...
He was the most massively, authentically human, civilized person.
Yes. Now, when Scherer says saint or saintly or holy, he was just giving a seed. But there were two things that then started to develop, and it's going to take years until it fully blossoms. Humility and charity. These are things that are totally, totally novel and are not to be found in a good, sound, natural ethics. I'll develop that later on when we come to transformation in Christ. But then he got engaged, and then he got married very, very young. And therefore he was so busy about other things that somehow, even though he was still very much concerned about Catholicism, it was a little bit on the back burner. And then something amazing happened in 1913. His second sister, Lisa, the painter, I claim was something of a genius. She had married an American of the name of Brewster, who had become an Italian, and they lived in Italy. They lived in Rome in a beautiful palace in the center of Rome. And all of a sudden, she was maybe the most worldly and secular of all his sisters. You know, such an extent that to go to church or to pray, I mean, she was the one who said, I mean, Christ cannot be compared for Beethoven, for goodness sake. I mean, you know, you must have a sense of proportion. And suddenly he hears to his amazement that she's entering the Catholic Church. And he was stunned. You know, he hadn't seen her for a while because he was studying in Göttingen. He was in northern Germany, and she was in Rome. Lisa is becoming a Catholic. And she invited him and my husband's wife to go to Rome and to be present when she entered the church in the catacomb of St. Callistus. And he went there, and he was so amazed to see this woman who was extraordinarily beautiful, extraordinarily talented, incredibly sure of herself. I mean, had she met Queen Victoria, I think she would have intimidated Queen Victoria. I mean, she was so absolutely the leading personality and so on and so on. And all of a sudden to see her kneel, to confess her sins, and to become he was moved to tears. And they went back to Rome from the catacombs, and he said to him, you know, you should truly, seriously consider converting. And he said, oh, I've been thinking about it for years. He said, no, please be careful. If you, the moment that grace knocks at the door, respond. Otherwise it may never come again. Promise, when you go back to Munich, that you're going to take instructions.
This is his sister speaking.
Liesel, you know, the beautiful, handsome, talented Liesel, suddenly kneeling down and recognizing that she was a sinful creature. For him it was. You know, because she was so absolutely certain of herself that, I mean, she wouldn't listen to anybody else. She knew better. You
know, just as a latecomer and a reader of your husband's works, and from knowing you, I also would guess that this little vignette, this picture that you've just given of his seeing his sister kneeling, had a massive effect on his imagination in this sense that I'm sure many people think that for someone to kneel is sort of groveling or obsequious, or sycophantic, or debasing. And in your husband's work, if one theme among others comes through, it is that it is a mark of the nobility of our true nature to be able to bow, to be able to kneel. That is far from groveling. You know, you see the true nobility of a great king or a great duke or a great woman like his sister capable of kneeling. You know, it's the little Napoleons and others like that who must strut and be the cock of the walk all the time, and to the capacity to kneel in front of that
which is
toward which
greater
I
than we
ought
are.
to kneel, which is greater. Of course, then we get into the biggest theme of all in your husband, response to value, which I
we're going
will
to
hold.
get there, hopefully.
Yes,
you know,
carry
even
on.
though I'm awfully sorry to say we're going to need 50 shows. I mean,
Yes.
we're just going to run short of time. At any rate, you know, Chesterton has formulated this very beautifully. He says, men forget how tall they are on their knees. It's a beautifully beautiful putting it. Now, you see, the difficulty is that I would like to talk about, you know, his studies with Husserl and Noah from his conversion. You know, what I'm trying to do is to whet the appetite of the public to read the biography, because this is going to come in great details. You know, I just have to skip a good many things. But one thing is certain, he goes back to Munich and he starts taking instructions. And two things are going to happen, which are amazing. He also was pretty self-assured. He knew that he was extremely talented. He came from this glorious world. You know, I mean, simply the highest that European culture could possibly afford or give. And all of a sudden, there he is, as a student, being taught by a Franciscan priest what the teaching of the church is. And the amazing thing is, when it was dogmas and so on, no difficulty. He accepted it all with joy, and from the first moment he was told about the Trinity, he was told about the sacraments, he was told and so on and so on. And his answer was yes, yes. And all of a sudden came a hitch. He had been married for 2 years, he had a little boy, and this Franciscan priest said, you know, the Roman Catholic Church does not allow artificial contraception. Now, I told you, and let me repeat this emphatically, that he had an extraordinary sense for ethics and for morality. This was right and this was wrong. You know, I've mentioned it, and let me repeat it. But the idea that artificial birth control is a sin, he said, no, that struck him truly as very strange indeed. He said, but I mean, after all, you're not killing anybody, you're just preventing life from coming into existence. And the priest was a real priest. Today you're going to find people say, well, you know, this is a secondary issue, doesn't matter very much, let's forget about it. And he said, no, either you accept the teaching of the church in its totality, or I cannot take you into the church. Period. And without a moment's hesitation, he said, I believe in order to understand. You know, he wasn't quoting St. Augustine and St. Anselm.
Yes.
Credo in Italian, but he says, the church says so, I bow. That's it.
Which again is I hate to keep interrupting, but
please do.
This is a major quality that we see in your husband and in his work, which is rare. The eager embracing of truth, even if that truth not only challenges me, but cuts right across everything I've ever thought. And in his mind, you see he's dead serious. I mean, you can't read your husband's work and sort of think, oh well, I'll pick out this part or that part. He is absolutely serious about what is true.
But let me anticipate. When he was a dying man, he one day said to me very solemnly, I confide my literary bequest to you. But I tell you earnestly, if you find any one sentence which is not in total agreement with the teaching of the church, do me one favor, burn it. Mm-hmm. Not very many intellectuals would say so. No. I mean, in other words, this love for the church, mm-hmm. this devotion to truth, this joy to submit to what is true, mm-hmm. this was one of the most striking, and I can tell you very frankly, when you meet someone like that, it touches your heart. Yes. Because it's something so extraordinary and so rare, particularly among intellectuals.
And again, it seems to me, the popular notion in our own time certainly would be, it's insofar as I break free of all sorts of shackles or that which sort of presides over me. If I break free of that, make my own choices, satisfy my own needs. We hear nothing these days except what are my needs, what are my needs. But your husband would be a case in point of someone who not only exhibited but believed and taught that it is by configuring myself to the truth, by embracing the truth as I see it, that is what brings me to my true dignity and fullness of humanity and freedom. It's a paradox.
Truth makes you free.
Yes.
You see, that was his experience. The very moment that I give myself, that I abandon myself, that I conform to what is objectively, in this very moment I'm liberated from all the shackles of my pride and mediocrity and indifference and self-centeredness.
Yeah.
You see, I mean, it was for him a sort of overwhelming experience. Well, he entered the church in April 1914 together with his wife.
So he was how?
He was 24 going on 25.
Yeah.
And from this moment on, I can only tell you, the teaching of the church herself, whom he loved with a passion, became the absolute center of his life. You cannot understand his work if you forget for one single moment that in this very moment he fell in love. And he was so inebriated, so overwhelmed simply by discovering the supernatural. Now there's an interesting parallel with Edith Stein. As I told you, the life of St. Francis of Assisi played a tremendous role. To see this lovable man rejoicing in suffering, rejoicing in imitating Christ, carrying the cross with a smile and a joy because he loved Christ. Edith Stein, reading the life of St. Teresa of Avila, and the next morning saying, I'm going to become a Roman Catholic. In both cases, it is the same identical experience, the discovery of the supernatural. Now, I have tried to sketch, imperfectly as I did it, the beautiful background that he had in Florence. And all of a sudden, when he discovered the supernatural, you know, love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you. You rejoice in being humiliated so that you can follow Christ, and so on and so on. He discovers a world. It is like someone who had always heard nice music, but suddenly hears the Ave Verum of Mozart, or the Passion according to St. Matthew. And he was so absolutely overwhelmed that two things are going to take place. From this moment on, he feels that he has a new philosophical vocation. His love for philosophy, his passion for philosophy did not diminish, but he felt somehow his particular mission was to illumine the amazing phenomenon that takes place the very moment that you discover the supernatural. You know, this is something that totally changed his life. That was a sort of revolution in him, which is going to have such an influence on his philosophical work that when, you know, recently I read, 30 years ago, someone wrote the history of phenomenology. And because he had written Transformation in Christ, because he had written Purity and Virginity, because he had written Literature and Personality, this man writes, Dietrich von Leeuwenhoek was a very talented disciple of Husserl, but he became Catholic and then became just a religious thinker. In other words, he's no longer taken, philosophically speaking, as a serious thinker because he cannot help it, but he's always bring the supernatural of the name of Christ. You see, and therefore, you know, to consider whatever is related to religion is not quite on the level of pure philosophy. And this is going to change and to transform his life. We're going to see it's going to change his whole conception of human life, of love, of marriage, of purity, of gratitude, and so on, of beauty. And this is what we're going to see through the other shows. I mean, the transformation which is going to take place.
And, you know, at this point, when he discovers the supernatural and is, shall we say, galvanized by this titanic reality, at that point, you know, he takes his place in the great procession, you might say, of Abraham and John the Baptist, and then Augustine and Benedict and Thomas and
particularly Augustine.
Augustine.
Yes.
And in this phenomenon, and right on up through the 12th and 13th century philosophers and on to Cardinal Newman and the rest, you see not a cramping or a diminishing or a dwindling of a man's powers and intellects and interests, but rather a tremendous efflorescence, a flowering, a fruition of everything that is there in a keen intellect and a massive aesthetic sense, such as your husband had.
Definitely, philosophically speaking, is to be inscribed in the line of St. Augustine, who had a tremendous influence on him, the Franciscan thinkers, St. Bonaventure, particularly Bonaventure, and then Cardinal Newman. I mean, these were, so to speak, the highlights, the people that influenced him most deeply in philosophy.
That's an august lineage.
Yes. All respect, I mean, a great respect, of course, for Thomas Aquinas, but his philosophical development is definitely Augustinian.
Yes.
You see, and so from now on, he's truly decided he's going to devote his life to this very particular mission, to illumine the transformation of man's fallen nature, wounded nature, not totally ruined nature, but wounded nature by the supernatural. And this is something which he's going to work on, and I mean his masterpiece, then is going to be Transformation in Christ. And then, of course, came the war, and I'm skipping the whole dramas that took place for 4 years. He couldn't do any philosophical work, except that he still managed in an amazing way to write his Habilitation, which is a second doctorate called necessary in Germany in order to teach at the university.
Yes, you must fill us in a little bit on
the question is that
such a difficult period in his life.
This is something that I have developed in my biography, and so I hope that people are going to turn to it, because I mean, otherwise I have no difficulty devoting the 13 shows to his biography, and then what about Transformation in Christ and purity and the rest of it, you see. So it seems to me that I've got to limit myself. But there came the war, which was a very dramatic period for him, and then he got his habilitation and started teaching. Then came the Communist Revolution in 1919, which was a horror, and in which he lost one of his close friends. And something very amazing happened. His friend was a fallen away Catholic. He wasn't practicing at all, and when the communists started this revolution in Munich, he went out and he was shot in the leg. And for some amazing reason, the doctor did not notice the bullet had remained in his leg, and then he died. But the amazing thing is, the moment he was wounded, he found back his faith. He was brought back, severely wounded, to his home, called a priest, re-entered the church. I mean, that was for my husband, once again, an amazing experience of what grace is. He experienced it. And then, he started teaching at the university, and from the first moment, of course, he was a bit of a revolution.
Where was it? Which university?
University of Munich. But don't forget, Munich is the capital of Bavaria, and Bavaria is a Catholic state. It was Catholic. Everybody was nominally Catholic. But then he was in for one very bitter experience. He found out 90%, 80% of the professors were Catholics, but the one great concern was not to show it, because the moment that you have a PhD and you are a doctor of philosophy or the doctor of science or the doctor whatever it might be, you find yourself in a higher category. And my husband, number one, he was an extrovert. Number two, he was born and raised in Italy. Number three, he loved people. And so he would talk to his students and establish friendship and so on and so on. The others, they came to the classroom, they delivered their talk, they left very, and then if students had any questions, they were referred to his assistant. But the professor, being on such a high level, of course, could not address the students himself, when my husband was doing so. And of course, that just amazed these German students used to very stiff professors. And one day he had 2 or 3 of his students who were young priests. And then he will always give them precedence. When they pass the door, in Europe all this is much more formal. You let the person who is higher pass in front of you, and every time he would say to the priest, please step ahead.
Whereas most university professors would assume...
Wait! You're anticipating.
Herr Professor.
You're anticipating. And one day one of his colleagues said, Professor Van Ilpen, why do you give precedence to your students? And my husband was amazed, and he said, but they're priests. Yes, but they have no PhD.
There we are. And we have to funnel down here to a point, but it seems to me that this is a wonderful and a significant, again, biographical incident which just occurred, quote unquote, in his life, and yet which suffuses his work. Namely, there's no question in his mind, there's no struggle in his mind, there's no combat in his mind over the fact that the holy and the true is the highest category, that you can have all the PhDs that Germany offers, and yet your husband was able to perceive that this young boy, this young man, who is, quote, nothing but a priest, he was able to perceive the mystery and the dignity in that, to which his own vocation was happy to defer.
The sense of the supernatural.
Yes.
That is the key.
A major theme. Well, thank you, Dr. von Hildebrand, for this episode, and we're eager for much more.